I stared at the 2 copper coins in my palm, then at the massive, bleeding wolf chained to the back of the fur trader's cart. His eyes were milky white, completely blind, yet he looked right through me. Buying him was madness. Knowing who he really was, that nearly destroyed me. The winter of our misery had settled deeply into the valley of High Peak. The mud in the village square had frozen into jagged, bone-breaking ruts, and the air smelled of wet wool, cheap ale, and desperation. For my family, desperation was a permanent resident. Ever since my father, Peter Garrick, failed to return from the northern timber woods 2 winters ago, the burden of survival fell entirely on my shoulders. My hands were perpetually raw from scrubbing linens for the wealthy merchants down by the river. But today I wasn't thinking of my aching joints. I was thinking of my 7-year-old sister Bridget. She lay in our crumbling stone cottage at the edge of the woods, her chest rattling with a fever that threatened to take her before the first snowfall. I squeezed the 2 copper coins tightly in my fist. They were the absolute last of our savings, scraped together by skipping meals and selling my mother's silver thimble. They were meant for Father Benedict, the village apothecary, who held the only bottle of lungwort syrup that could break Bridget's fever. Step up, you miserable lot. Look at this beast, fresh from the deep ridges. The harsh, gravelly voice of Aldous Kempton, the region's most brutal beast trapper, cut through the biting wind. A crowd had gathered around his heavy wooden wagon. Aldous was a massive man, smelling of rancid grease and stale sweat, his beard matted with dried blood that wasn't his own. He was kicking the iron bars of a low cage mounted to the back of his cart. Curiosity got the better of me. I pushed through the crowd of haggard townspeople, including Martha Higgins, the baker's wife, who gave me a disapproving look as I squeezed past. Inside the cage lay a monster. It was a wolf, but it was easily 3 times the size of any timber wolf I had ever seen. Its fur was a striking, pristine white, though it was currently matted with thick, dark gore and caked with mountain mud. Heavy iron chains were wrapped around its thick neck, pinned to the floor of the cage. But it wasn't the size or the coat that made the crowd gasp. It was the creature's face. 2 deep, jagged claw marks ran across its brow, and its eyes were wide open, completely clouded over with a milky, ghostly white film. It was totally blind. "He's useless to me," Aldous spat, slamming a heavy iron rod against the bars. The wolf didn't even flinch. It merely raised its massive head, its nose twitching as it scented the air. An ambush in the crags found him tangled in silver wire traps, already blinded by some rival pack's venom or a hunter's blade. A blind wolf can't hunt, and his hide is ruined from the traps. I'm going to bash his skull in behind the tavern and sell his fat to the greasemakers. A murmur went through the crowd. To the people of High Peak, a wolf was a pest, a killer of sheep. Nobody cared if it died. But then the blind wolf turned his head. He didn't look at Aldous. He didn't look at the shouting men. He turned his sightless, milky eyes directly toward me. It was impossible he was blind, but I felt the phantom weight of his gaze press into my chest. There was no wild, rabid madness in those eyes. There was a profound, agonizing sorrow, a silent, royal dignity that even the mud and chains couldn't wash away. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Move away, Maeve," my inner voice screamed. "Think of Bridget. Think of the medicine. I'll give you a copper for him." Owen, the blacksmith's lazy apprentice, shouted with a laugh. "The hide will make a decent rug for my dog to sleep on." A copper. I spent 3 days dragging this heavy bastard down the mountain. Aldous growled, raising his iron rod. "I'd rather kill him myself for the sport of it." Before my brain could stop my hands, I stepped forward. 2 coppers. I said, my voice ringing out clearly in the cold air. The square went dead silent. Martha Higgins gasped. Aldous lowered his rod, his yellowed eyes narrowing as they locked onto me. "What did you say, girl?" he sneered. "2 copper coins," I repeated, my fingers trembling as I held them out. The metal felt ice cold against my skin. For the wolf. Alive. "Maeve, have you lost your mind?" Martha hissed from behind me, grabbing my shawl. "Your sister is dying in her bed, and you're buying a useless rabid beast. You can't eat wolf meat." Aldous stepped down from the wagon, his heavy boots thudding against the frozen earth. He snatched the coins from my hand, his filthy fingers brushing against mine. He bit one of the coppers, verified its weight, and a cruel grin spread across his face. "He's yours, Bint, girl." Aldous laughed, unlocking the cage and tossing the heavy leather lead rope at my feet. "But you drag him away yourself. If he catches his scent back and tears your throat out, don't look for a refund." The crowd erupted into mocking laughter as Aldous and his men began unchaining the beast from the cage floor, leaving only the neck collar and the heavy rope. The massive white wolf slowly stood up. Even weakened, his shoulders reached my chest. He stumbled slightly, his hind leg injured, his milky eyes staring blankly ahead. I looked at the rope in my hand, then at the sky. The sun was setting. I had just spent Bridget's survival money on a dying, blind predator. Fear, sharp and cold, pierced my stomach. What had I done? "Come on, boy." I whispered, my voice shaking as I gently tugged the rope. "Let's go before they change their minds." To my absolute shock, the wolf didn't lunge at me. He didn't growl. He simply took a deep breath of the air around me, bowed his massive head, and followed my stride, his heavy paws thudding softly in the freezing mud. It took me over an hour to drag the wolf back to our isolated cottage at the edge of the whispering woods. By the time we reached the wooden door, my hands were bleeding from the rough rope, and the wolf was limping heavily, his breathing ragged and shallow. Inside the cottage was freezing. The fire had died down to low, glowing embers. On the small straw cot in the corner, Bridget was tossing and turning, her skin flushed dark red, a terrible wet cough tearing through her small body. "Maeve!" She whimpered, her eyes half open and glazed with sickness. "Is that the medicine?" Tears stung my eyes. I couldn't tell her the truth. I couldn't tell her I had traded her breath for a beast. "I'm making it now, sweetie." I lied, my voice cracking. "Just close your eyes." The white wolf stepped into the cottage, his massive frame taking up nearly half the small room. Bridget let out a weak cry of terror, pulling the thin wool blanket over her nose. "It's okay, Bridget. He won't hurt you. He's blind. He's hurt just like you." I reassured her, though my own heart was racing. The wolf stopped. He turned his head toward the corner where Bridget lay. Slowly, deliberately, he walked over to her cot. I reached for the iron poker by the hearth, terrified he was going to attack, but the beast merely lowered his massive, blood-stained muzzle and gently pressed his nose against Bridget's burning forehead. Bridget ceased her crying. Her breathing, which had been frantic and shallow, instantly slowed down. The wolf let out a deep, low rumble from his chest. Not a growl, but a rhythmic, soothing sound that felt like the vibration of a heavy church bell. He then collapsed onto the dirt floor, right beside her bed, resting his heavy chin on his paws, his sightless eyes fixed on the door. For the next 3 hours I worked in a frenzy. I didn't have Father Benedict's syrup, but I knew basic woodcraft. I ran out to the edge of the forest, gathering frozen pine needles and willow bark to boil into a bitter tea. When I returned, I began tending to the wolf. He remained completely still as I brought a basin of warm water and a clean rag. As I washed the dried blood from his white fur, I realized the sheer extent of his injuries. His back was crisscrossed with deep, burning lacerations that smelled faintly of burnt flesh, the telltale sign of silver weapons. But it was when I wiped the mud from his shoulder that my breath caught in my throat. Embedded into his skin, hidden beneath the thick coat, was a brand. It wasn't the crude mark of a cattle rancher or a fur trapper. It was an intricate, swirling crest of a crescent moon cradling a roaring dragon. My blood ran cold. I wasn't a scholar, but everyone in the Northern Territories knew that crest. It belonged to the royal house of Galacrest, the high Lycan royalty. I looked down at the wolf. He was watching me, or rather listening to me. His ears twitched at the sudden acceleration of my heartbeat. "Who are you?" I whispered, my hand hovering over his matted fur. The wolf didn't answer, of course, but he nudged my hand with his wet nose, his touch surprisingly gentle. By midnight, a miracle happened. Bridget's fever broke. Her skin became cool to the touch, and her deep, rattling cough completely vanished. She slept soundly, her tiny hand draped over the white wolf's massive paw. I knew Willowbark wasn't that powerful. I looked at the wolf whose own wounds were already beginning to knit together at an impossible supernatural speed. The silver burns on his back were closing, forming thick, pale scars before my very eyes. This was no ordinary wolf. He was a Lycan shifter, and based on his size and the royal brand, he was someone incredibly dangerous. The next evening, the fragile piece of our cottage was shattered. I was boiling a meager pot of cabbage soup when the heavy wooden door was suddenly kicked off its leather hinges. It slammed inward, shattering against the stone floor. Cold wind rushed into the room along with two men. It was Geoffrey the tavern keeper's thuggish brother and Owen the blacksmith's apprentice. Both carried heavy iron clubs, their faces twisted with drunken malice. "Well, look here," Geoffrey sneered, stepping into the room and eyeing the small pot of soup. "The crazy girl and her monster." "What do you want?" I demanded, stepping in front of Bridget's cot, my hands gripping an iron kitchen knife. "Get out of my house." "Aldous realizes he made a bad trade," Owen barked, spitting on our floor. "A traveling merchant passed through the tavern an hour ago. Said a pure white wolf hide is worth 50 gold sovereigns to the high lords in the capital. Aldous wants his property back, girl. He sent us to collect it. And if you give us any trouble, we'll take your little sister too." Bridget began to scream, terrified, scrambling backward against the stone wall. "You bought him fair and square. I gave him my last coins." I yelled, my voice shaking as Geoffrey stepped closer, raising his iron club. "Rules change when gold is involved. Sweet cheeks." Geoffrey laughed, lunging forward to grab my hair. I braced for the blow, raising my knife, but I never got the chance to strike. From the shadows behind the table, a white blur erupted with the force of a falling avalanche. The blind wolf didn't roar. He didn't give a warning growl. He struck with absolute lethal precision. Even without his sight, his ears and nose guided him unerringly through the dimly lit room. He slammed his massive chest into Geoffrey, throwing the grown man across the room like a rag doll. Geoffrey crashed into the stone hearth, his club flying from his hand. Owen screamed in terror, swinging his iron club wildly. The wolf ducked beneath the swing with the grace of a seasoned warrior, his jaws clamping down on Owen's thigh. The sound of crunching bone echoed through the cottage. Owen shrieked, collapsing to the ground as the wolf violently shook him, tearing through muscle and leather. "Get it off me! Get it off!" Owen wailed, his blood pooling on the dirt floor. Geoffrey, scrambling to his feet, bleeding from his forehead, saw the ferocity of the beast and lost his nerve entirely. He didn't try to fight. He scrambled out the broken doorway, sprinting into the dark woods, leaving his partner behind. The wolf released Owen, who was clutching his mangled leg, weeping and crawling backward out the door into the snow. Don't let him kill me." Owen gasped, his face pale with shock, before finally dragging himself out into the freezing night, his blood leaving a dark trail in the snow. I stood frozen, the kitchen knife trembling in my hand. The cottage was dead silent, except for Bridget's soft sobbing. The white wolf turned around to face me. He was covered in fresh blood, the thug's blood. But as I stared at him in horror, I noticed something that made the air leave my lungs. The milky white film over his eyes was cracking. Like melting ice on a lake, the blindness was receding, revealing two piercing, brilliant pools of liquid royal gold. They glowed in the dim light of the dying fire, radiating an immense, crushing aura of pure authority. He wasn't just a lichen. The golden eyes were the biological hallmark of the highest caste of shapeshifters, the ruling bloodline. Before I could process this, the heavy sound of galloping horses echoed from the village trail. Dozens of them. The thud of iron hooves shook the ground, accompanied by the clanking of heavy steel armor. I rushed to the broken doorway and looked out. Through the trees, the village square of High Peak was illuminated by dozens of burning torches. A massive battalion of royal soldiers draped in silver and crimson capes had completely surrounded the village. At their head rode a towering man in black armor, his shield bearing the same crest as the brand on my wolf's shoulder. Search every house, every barn, every hovel. A booming voice echoed across the valley. The Alpha King, Alistair Caldwell, was ambushed near these mountains. If the traitors have killed him, this village burns. Find the king. My breath hitched. I slowly turned around to look at the massive white wolf standing in my broken kitchen. His golden eyes locked onto mine, filled with an unspoken heavy request. I hadn't just saved a stray animal. I had purchased the missing ruler of the entire Lycan Empire for 2 miserable copper coins, and the royal army was right outside my door. The heavy thud of armored boots echoed through the frozen mud outside. Torches cast frantic, dancing shadows against the cracked stone walls of our cottage. I stood entirely paralyzed, staring at the colossal white wolf, whose golden eyes were now completely clear, piercing through the darkness with predatory intelligence. Search the perimeter. Duke William's orders are clear. Leave no stone unturned. A harsh voice barked from the tree line. At the mention of the name William, a low, terrifying snarl vibrated from the beast's chest. The air in the room suddenly grew unbearably hot, smelling intensely of pine needles and ozone. The wolf did not run for the back window to escape. Instead, he stepped between the broken doorway and myself, shielding Bridget's cot with his massive frame. Then, the unimaginable happened. The sound of snapping bone and shifting cartilage filled the cramped room. I gasped, covering my mouth, as the wolf's brilliant white fur began to recede, melting into pale, heavily scarred skin. His spine arched his limbs, elongating the monstrous canine anatomy, folding and reshaping in a violent display of ancient magic. Within seconds, the beast was gone. In his place knelt a man. He was breathtakingly formidable, broad-shouldered and towering. Even while crouching, his physique was carved from pure muscle and marked by battle. Thick silver-white hair cascaded past his shoulders, framing a jawline sharp enough to cut glass. Across his broad chest, the royal brand of the Galacrest dragon stood out vividly against a fresh network of burns wounds inflicted by silver weapons. But it was his eyes that stole my breath. They remained that intense, glowing liquid gold. Alistair Caldwell, the Alpha King. He stood up smoothly, pulling a torn woolen blanket from a nearby chair to wrap around his waist. His gaze locked onto mine, completely devoid of the blind vulnerability I had seen just hours ago. "You saved my life, Maeve." His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that sent a sudden electric shiver down my spine. It was a voice used to commanding armies, yet it held a soft, unexpected reverence. You know my name." I stammered, my kitchen knife slipping from my trembling fingers to clatter against the stone floor. "I heard your sister speak it. I heard everything." Alistair stepped forward. The sheer physical presence of him commanded absolute submission, but I forced my chin up. "I know you traded your last 2 coppers to spare me from the slaughter. I know you sacrificed your sister's medicine." "The soldiers," I whispered, pointing a shaking finger toward the window. "They are looking for you. If you are the king, why did you growl at your own army?" A dark, dangerous shadow crossed his handsome features. The treachery of the court. Alistair turned his gaze to the window, his golden eyes narrowing. "They are not my army. They are wearing my colours, but they answered to my half-brother, Duke William. 3 days ago, my royal convoy was ambushed in the high crags." He quickly outlined the betrayal, his words sharp, and clipped the trap. "William hired northern poachers to line the mountain pass with silver-laced snare wire. It is an ancient, cowardly tactic meant to burn a lycan's flesh and blind our sight. The poison. The wires were coated in wolfsbane ash. It induced a coma and temporarily stole my vision. I woke up in chains, tossed in the back of a filthy trapper's wagon. The motive, without an heir. My death transfers the throne of the Lycan Empire directly to William. He sent these men to finish the job under the guise of a rescue mission. They will kill you." I breathed out the horrific reality crashing down on me. "If they find you here wounded without your royal guard." "I heal fast, little bird. The willow bark and your touch accelerated my recovery," Alistair said, taking another step closer. He reached out his large, calloused fingers, gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear. The touch was incredibly tender for a man who had just crushed a thug's leg. "But I will not let them harm you or the child. You are under my absolute protection." "In here I found blood," a soldier yelled from just outside our door. The trail left by Owen had led them straight to our threshold. Alistair's jaw clenched. He shoved me gently behind him, positioning himself squarely in the center of the broken doorway. 3 soldiers rushed in, their drawn broadswords gleaming in the torchlight. They were fully armored, their faces hidden behind steel visors. "By the gods!" The lead soldier gasped, halting so fast he nearly tripped. "The king!" "Drop your weapons," Alistair commanded. The sheer authoritative force in his voice was a physical weight, a supernatural compulsion that forced the soldiers to their knees. "Your Grace," the second soldier stammered, dropping his sword. "Duke William told us you were slain by rogue mountain clans. We were told to secure the perimeter and await his arrival. William is a traitor, and you are trespassing in the home of my savior." Alistair's voice dropped to a lethal whisper. "Where is the Duke?" "He rides behind us, sire. He should arrive in High Peak within the hour." Alistair looked back at me, a dangerous, calculating gleam in his golden eyes. He had been a hunted beast. Now he was a king preparing for war. The village square of High Peak had been transformed from a muddy, miserable trading post into a heavily militarized encampment. Torches blazed, illuminating the terrified faces of the villagers who had been forced from their beds. I stood beside Alistair, my hand firmly held within his large, warm grip. He had donned a heavy cloak, taken from one of the kneeling soldiers, though his chest remained bare, exposing the royal brand. Bridget was asleep, safely hidden away in the cottage, under the guard of the 3 soldiers Alistair had mentally dominated. The crowd parted violently as a massive black stallion rode into the square. Atop the horse sat Duke William, wearing gleaming silver-plated armor. He looked exactly like Alistair, save for his eyes, which were a dull, ordinary brown. Trailing behind him on foot, bound in ropes, was Aldous Kempton, the beast trapper who had sold Alistair to me. William halted his horse, his eyes locking on to Alistair. For a fraction of a second, raw panic flashed across the Duke's face before he masked it with a sickening false smile. "Brother," William cried out, dismounting smoothly. "The gods be praised, I feared the worst when we found your slaughtered guards." Alistair didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He merely stepped forward, pulling me along with him. The entire village watched in stunned silence. Martha Higgins, the baker's wife, who had scolded me yesterday, looked as though she might faint. "Save your breath, William." Alistair's voice echoed off the stone buildings, carrying a supernatural resonance that made the villagers cower. "Your assassins failed. The silver snares failed. And your reign as heir ends tonight." William's smile vanished, replaced by a cold sneer. "You have no proof of these wild accusations, brother. You are delirious from your injuries. Look at you standing half-naked in the mud with a peasant girl." He gestured toward his battalion of 60 heavily armed men. "Guards. The king's mind is compromised. Apprehend him for his own safety." The soldiers drew their weapons but hesitated. Alistair was still the Alpha King. "Do you want proof?" Alistair roared, his eyes glowing furiously. He pointed a finger at Aldous, who was trembling violently on his knees. "Trapper, tell the Duke who paid you to drag a blinded wolf into this miserable village instead of delivering him to the capital." Aldous whimpered, looking between the heavily armed Duke and the towering, enraged king. It was the Duke's men. They paid me 50 silver coins. They told me to let the beast die of its wounds in the snow." William drew his broadsword with blinding speed. "Liar," he shouted, lunging forward to decapitate the trapper and silence him. But Alistair was faster. He didn't need to shift into his wolf form to access his power. Alistair moved like a blur, stepping inside his brother's guard. He clamped his massive hand around William's throat, lifting the fully armored Duke clean off the ground. William choked, thrashing wildly, his sword clattering into the mud. "You sought my crown through cowardice," Alistair growled, his golden eyes blazing inches from William's terrified face. "You sought to end my lineage. But the moon goddess works in mysterious ways. She delivered me to the very edge of death, only to show me exactly what I have been looking for." Alistair threw William to the ground with bone-shattering force. "Arrest him!" Alistair commanded the surrounding army. This time the soldiers did not hesitate. The true king had proven his strength. They swarmed the fallen duke, stripping him of his weapons and dragging him away. The village square fell entirely silent. Only the crackle of the torches could be heard. Alistair turned his back on his disgraced brother and walked slowly back toward me. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. Yesterday, I was a starving orphan girl scrubbing floors. Tonight, the king of the lichens was looking at me as if I were the only person in the world. He stopped in front of me, taking both of my raw red hands in his. "You spent your last 2 coins on a dying beast," Alistair said softly, loud enough for the villagers to hear, but his tone was intensely private. "You offered me mercy when my own blood offered me death. You did not recoil from my scars, nor did you flee when danger arrived at your door." I just couldn't let them kill you," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "And now no one will ever harm you again," Alistair vowed. He slowly dropped to one knee, right there in the frozen mud. The collective gasp of the villagers echoed through the square. An Alpha King kneels for absolutely no one. "Maeve Garrick." Alistair spoke, his golden eyes shining with profound devotion. "You saved my life. But more than that, my wolf recognized you the moment you spoke. You are my destined mate. Come with me to the capital. Let me give you and Bridget the world." I looked down at the man who had terrified me, awed me, and protected me. I thought of the 2 copper coins, the desperate gamble that changed everything. "Yes." I breathed out a smile, breaking through my tears. "I will." Alistair stood wrapping me in a fierce, crushing embrace. As the soldiers dropped to their knees in a unified salute to their new queen, I buried my face in his chest, knowing that the frozen, miserable winter of our past was finally over. Did this thrilling tale of Maeve and the Alpha King leave you on the edge of your seat? If you loved this unexpected medieval romance, filled with royal betrayals, incredible twists, and a love that defied all odds, please do not forget to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fantasy drama lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more breathtaking stories every single week. Leave a comment below with your absolute favorite moment. See you soon.